When you reach a certain age, when the decades behind you begin to feel longer than the decades ahead, something remarkable happens in the depths of the psyche. It is then that the empath, the one who has spent a lifetime feeling the emotional tremors of the world, begins to undergo a transformation that cannot be fully understood by those who have lived more on the surface of existence. This transformation is subtle, silent, almost invisible to the untrained observer, yet psychologically it is one of the most profound metamorphoses a human being can experience. I have often said that the psyche does not age the way the body does. The body grows old, the skin softens, the bones become fragile. But the psyche follows a very different chronology, a sacred, symbolic time, and the empath psyche, in particular, becomes more luminous, more transparent, more attuned to that inner frequency where life and eternity begin to whisper to one another. It is in old age that the empath finally begins to understand the real meaning of everything they carried, everything they felt, everything they absorbed from the world long before they had the words for it. Because you must understand, an empath does not simply grow old. They deepen, they descend into a kind of inner ocean that many people never dare to touch. And the beauty of the empath's old age is not found in what they say, but in what they no longer feel compelled to explain. Silence becomes their language, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have finally realized that truth does not need an audience, it simply needs a vessel. In youth, the empath feels everything so intensely that the world often becomes overwhelming. They feel the unspoken tension in a room the way others feel a change in temperature. They absorb another person's sorrow as if it were their own. They internalize conflict even when they are not involved in it. And they do this not because they want to, but because their psyche is constructed like a sensitive instrument tuned to frequencies. Most people do not perceive, but with age comes something different. With age comes the integration of the shadow, not in a dramatic moment of enlightenment, but through the slow, steady acceptance of everything. The psyche once resisted. The empath in their older years becomes less reactive, less porous, not because they have lost sensitivity, but because they have gained structure. The unconscious contents that once surged through them like uncontrollable waves begin to find their patterns, their meanings, their rightful places. Imagine, for a moment, an old violin. Its wood has absorbed decades of sound, decades of music, resonance, vibration. It becomes richer, not poorer. Its timbre becomes deeper, not weaker. This is the empath. In old age, their emotional body becomes like an ancient instrument that no longer tries to impress the world with its sound, but simply resonates with what is true. I have heard many empaths say, as they grow older, that they no longer feel the need to fight for harmony in the world. They no longer rush to soothe the distressed, no longer sacrifice their peace to maintain the peace of others. This is not indifference, it is wisdom. It is the realization that one cannot heal the world while abandoning oneself. A younger empath often believes they must save everyone, but an older empath has finally met the archetype within the inner healer and understands that healing never comes from force. It comes from alignment. There is a tremendous beauty in watching an empath step into this stage of life. The lines on their face become symbolic, each one a story, a leçon, a quiet victory over experiences that would have broken a less sensitive soul. Their eyes soften, not with sorrow, but with recognition. They see the world as it is, not as they wish it to be, and yet they love it more deeply than ever. This, I must tell you, is a triumph of the empathic archetype, the ability to feel the full weight of reality while remaining rooted in the self, unshaken and uninterested in performing for the expectations of others. The empath in old age no longer carries the burden of explaining their perceptions. They no longer defend their intuition. Throughout their life, they were often misunderstood, seen as too emotional, too sensitive, too imaginative. People who live on the surface rarely understand those who live in the depths. But there comes a point, often later in life, when the empath realizes that understanding was never the goal. They were not meant to be understood by everyone. They were meant to understand themselves. The individuation process culminates here, where self-understanding replaces the need for external validation. And ironically, it is precisely when the empath stops seeking to be understood that they begin to radiate a kind of presence that others finally notice. Not because the empath becomes louder, but because their silence becomes magnetic. They carry an inner stillness that cannot be faked. Let me speak of dreams for a moment, because dreams reveal much about the empath's inner evolution. When empaths are young, their dreams are often vivid, chaotic, filled with archetypal figures, demanding attention: the wounded child, the trickster, the shadowy stranger, the overflowing river, the burning house. These symbols express the unintegrated emotional life of the empath, but as they grow older, their dreams change. The symbols become calmer, more coherent. Water that once flooded now becomes a still lake. The burning house becomes a warm home. The shadow becomes an old companion. This shift in dreams is not mere coincidence. It reflects the psyche's resolution of inner conflict. The unconscious becomes less turbulent because the conscious ego has finally ceased resisting it. The empath in old age no longer fears their depth. They have spent a lifetime drowning and resurfacing, until they finally learn how to breathe underwater. There is something profoundly mystical about this. It is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. The empath, by virtue of their sensitivity, has always lived close to the boundary between worlds, the visible and the invisible, the conscious and the unconscious, the personal and the collective. In old age, this boundary becomes more transparent, they sense the presence of memory, not only from their own life, but from the collective unconscious itself. Their insights become more symbolic, more archetypal, less dependent on logic, and more attuned to the language of the soul. You must understand, sensitivity does not diminish with age. It becomes refined. The empath's heart no longer reacts impulsively. It listens, it discerns, it feels without being consumed. And this, perhaps, is the silent beauty of the empath's later years. The ability to touch the emotional truth of the world without losing themselves in it. I have often observed that older empaths possess a kind of serene melancholy, not depression, not sadness, but a quiet understanding that comes from seeing life without illusions. They know that suffering is woven into existence. They know that people project their wounds onto one another. They know that love is often tangled with fear and longing. And yet, despite knowing all this, they remain open-hearted. They love not because the world is gentle, but because their soul is. In this stage of life, the empath no longer chases connection. They no longer cling to relationships that drain them. They no longer fear solitude. In fact, solitude becomes sacred. It becomes a space where they meet themselves, where they converse with the unconscious, where the psyche finally breathes without interruption. Solitude in old age is not loneliness, it is communion. And it is here, in this sacred solitude, that the empath begins to see their entire life differently. The betrayals that once devastated them now reveal their deeper meaning. The relationships that exhausted them now appear as teachers. The wounds that shaped them now emerge as symbols of initiation. Every heartbreak becomes an archetype. Every disappointment a mythic journey. The empath in old age realizes they were never fragile. They were merely unstructured. Sensitivity was never their weakness. It was their calling, and this realization transforms them. Their presence becomes like a quiet fire, steady, warm, unafraid. There is a particular moment, often somewhere in the later decades of life, when the empath stops rushing. They stop rescuing. They stop absorbing. They begin to see that not every suffering is theirs to carry. Not every conflict is theirs to solve. Not every cry is theirs to answer. This is not selfishness. It is psychological boundaries born from maturity. It is the ego finally releasing its compulsive need to prove its goodness. And from this release comes a new kind of power, not the power of domination, but the power of inner rootedness. The empath begins to act not from guilt, but from clarity, not from fear, but from wisdom, not from impulsive compassion, but from conscious compassion. If you have ever met an older empath, truly met them, you will know what I mean when I say they emanate a kind of gentle gravity. Their presence grounds you. Their silence reassures you. Their words, when they choose to speak, feel as though they emerge from a deep well that has taken decades to fill. This is the silent beauty of the empath. In old age, they carry the emotional history of a lifetime, yet they walk with the lightness of someone who has learned to let the world be what it is. They have learned that peace is not found by controlling the external world, but by integrating the internal one. And in this integration, they finally touch the self, the eternal, the unbroken, the center of the psyche that has been calling to them since their earliest memories. And as the empath steps deeper into the later chapters of life, something remarkable begins to unfold within the psyche, something both ancient and strangely new. It is the subtle realization that their sensitivity was never simply an emotional tendency, but an archetypal inheritance, a calling woven into their very structure. When they look back at their early years, they begin to see how every moment of overwhelm, every inexplicable sadness, every quiet intuition was not accidental, but part of a larger symbolic journey. The empath in old age becomes capable of reading their own life as if it were a myth, and every myth contains truths that can only be grasped with time, maturity, and the slow unveiling of the unconscious. When I speak of myth, I do not mean fantasy or fiction. Myth, psychologically, is the language of the collective unconscious. It is the way the psyche expresses truths too profound for literal explanation. The empath's entire life is a myth written in emotion, and old age is the moment when this myth finally becomes legible. The empaths can see how their longing for harmony expressed the archetype of the healer, how their early self-sacrifice emerged from the archetype of the martyr, how their intuition reflected the archetype of the seer, but most importantly, they begin to see something they could not grasp in youth, that every archetype contains its shadow. The healer carries the wound they instinctively try to cure in others. The martyr carries the fear of abandonment that drives their selflessness. The seer carries the terror of knowing too much and not being believed. In youth, the empath often identifies unconsciously with these archetypes, living inside them without understanding their costs. But in old age, the empath begins to step out, to see the archetype not as identity, but as force. They begin to hold these energies lightly, no longer allowing them to dictate their destiny. This shift is not merely psychological, it is alchemical. Old age performs a kind of inner distillation. The psyche, stripped of external ambition and societal expectation, begins to refine itself. The empath becomes less tangled in personal stories and more attuned to the symbolic meaning behind them. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they begin to ask, "What was this trying to teach me?" This question transforms suffering into depth, confusion into insight, and memory into wisdom. What once felt like misfortune begins to reveal itself as initiation, many older empaths describe a sudden understanding that arrives not through thinking, but through a kind of inner seeing. It is the moment when the unconscious surfaces with clarity, offering truths that were invisible for decades. This is the gift of sensitivity in old age, the capacity to see patterns, not just in others, but in oneself. It is the moment when the empath realizes that every person who hurt them, every relationship that drained them, every disappointment that silenced them, was acting out a deeper psychic script, one that mirrored their own unhealed patterns. And so the empath learns, often very late in life, that forgiveness is not an act of moral superiority. It is an act of release. It is the moment when they reclaim the emotional energy they scattered across years of misunderstanding. Forgiveness for the older empath becomes less about the other person and more about freeing themselves from the psychic chains that kept them anchored to an outdated identity. This is the quiet freedom of the elder empath, the recognition that they can love without attachment, care without depletion, and be present without absorbing what is not theirs. Let us speak for a moment about the shadow, because the shadow becomes especially significant in the empath's later years. When one is young, the shadow is often projected outward. The empath sees cruelty, arrogance, manipulation, or indifference in others and instinctively recoils. They sense darkness in the world and believe it threatens their purity. But with age, something radical happens. The empath finally turns inward. They see that the traits they feared in others existed in subtle form within themselves. Their resistance to this truth begins to soften. They no longer view the shadow as an enemy, but as a neglected companion. And in embracing this companion, they become whole. Wholeness is the true destination of the empath's later life, not perfection. In youth, many empaths try desperately to be good friends, good partners, good caretakers, good healers. But goodness, when pursued compulsively, becomes a mask. It becomes a performance rooted in fear, fear of being rejected, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being perceived as selfish. With age, the empath begins to let this performance fall away. They discover that true goodness has nothing to do with pleasing others. It arises naturally from a psyche that is integrated, grounded, and aligned with the self. This is why older empaths are no longer easily manipulated. They have seen too much, felt too much, endured too much to be deceived by superficial gestures or false promises. Their intuition, once a source of confusion, becomes a silent compass. They trust their inner signals without needing external confirmation. They sense dishonesty in a glance, instability in a tone of voice, hidden motives in a casual comment. But unlike the younger empath, who reacts with anxiety or self-doubt, the older empath simply observes. They allow the truth to reveal itself without rushing to intervene. This is the serenity of age, the capacity to see clearly without becoming entangled. And yet, beneath this serenity lies a tenderness that never fades. Sensitivity does not harden with time, it ripens. The older empath feels deeply, perhaps even more deeply than before, but they feel from a place of inner security rather than vulnerability. They can listen to another person's sorrow without drowning in it. They can offer compassion without sacrificing their boundaries. They can love without losing themselves. This is the evolution of empathy, from emotional fusion to emotional presence. Dreams in old age reflect this presence with astonishing clarity. I have read the dreams of many elderly empaths, and there is a recurring symbol that appears far more frequently than in their youth: the bridge. A bridge over water, a bridge between two mountains, a bridge appearing suddenly in the fog. The bridge is the archetype of transition, the passage between inner worlds. It symbolizes the empath's journey from emotional chaos to emotional coherence. It marks the integration of the unconscious with the conscious, and it whispers a truth that only the aging psyche understands, that life is not meant to be conquered, but crossed. In these dream bridges, the water beneath is calm, no longer the turbulent floodwaters of earlier dreams. The mountains are not obstacles, but witnesses. The fog is not fear, but mystery. These dreams symbolize the soul of the empath reaching a point of quiet passage, a psychological crossing that prepares them for the later stages of individuation. It is in this stage that time becomes different. The empath begins to experience a strange relationship with time. It feels slower and faster at once. Slow because they savor small details that others overlook: the way sunlight hits the floor, the softness of a voice, the stillness of morning air. Fast because the psyche no longer clings to days or years, but to moments of meaning. This shift reveals a profound truth: that meaning is not found in the quantity of experiences, but in the depth of one's presence within them. The older empath also begins to recognize the cycles of life that were once invisible to them. They see how every season of their existence mirrored an inner transformation. They see how every loss carved space for clarity. They see how every departure prepared them for solitude. They see how every love, whether it stayed or left, expanded their capacity to feel. And in this recognition, they experience something that youth can never offer: gratitude for the full complexity of their emotional destiny. There is a profound sacredness in this gratitude. It is not naive or sentimental. It is seasoned. It has walked through storms and come out with its integrity intact. The empath in old age is no longer shocked by human behavior. They understand how people wound one another unconsciously, how projection operates as a defense, how the ego clings to illusions, how the shadow seeks expression when suppressed. This understanding does not make them cynical. It makes them compassionate, but it is a quiet compassion, free of urgency, rooted in acceptance rather than impulse, This is why the presence of an older empath often feels like a sanctuary. They do not attempt to fix you. They do not judge you. They do not tell you what to do. They simply hold a space in which your own psyche can breathe. Their listening becomes a form of healing, not because they offer solutions, but because they offer clarity. Clarity through their stillness. Clarity through their presence. Clarity through their ability to see beneath the surface of things without needing to name every insight. If you observe an older empath carefully, you will notice that they move through the world with a kind of gentle invisibility. They no longer need to be seen. They no longer crave acknowledgement. Their ego is quieted, not through suppression, but through integration. They have learned that the most profound experiences cannot be explained, only lived, and so they walk with a humility that does not diminish them, but amplifies their authenticity. There is a phrase I often used in my practice: the psyche protects its own timing. You cannot force maturity. You cannot accelerate wisdom. You cannot rush integration. And this is why the empath's later years are so extraordinary. They reveal truths that could not have emerged earlier, because the ego was not yet ready to hold them. Age becomes the container that allows the unconscious to flow without overwhelming. Age becomes the structure that permits the empath to stand in their depth without drowning in it. The empath in old age is a paradox, a heart that feels more than ever and yet is disturbed less than ever, a soul that sees deeper than ever and yet judges less than ever, a presence that carries the weight of a lifetime and yet walks with the ease of someone who has finally set that weight down. And it is in this paradox that their silent beauty is found. As the empath moves further into the latter stages of life, an even deeper transformation begins to unfold, one that is not easily recognized from the outside, but is profoundly felt within the inner landscape of the psyche. It is the emergence of a new relationship with the unconscious, one that is no longer based on fear or confusion, but on cooperation. Throughout their younger years, the empaths often experienced the unconscious as a force that intruded upon them waves of emotion they could not explain, intuitions they could not articulate, moods that arrived without warning, dreams that unsettled rather than clarified. But in old age, all of this begins to shift. The unconscious becomes less of a burden and more of a guide, a companion with whom they now walk in quiet understanding. This shift is not sudden. It happens slowly, often so gradually that the empath does not realize it until they look back and notice that their inner storms have softened. Feelings that once overwhelmed them now move through like gentle tides. Intuitions that once frightened them now feel like insights whispered by an ancient teacher. Dreams that once felt chaotic now appear symbolic, coherent, even prophetic. The psyche becomes a landscape they can navigate rather than a labyrinth they fear being lost within. This inner familiarity is one of the great blessings of old age for the empath, the blessing of knowing one's own depth without being terrified of it. When I worked with older patients, particularly those with empathic dispositions. I observed something fascinating. They were no longer searching for themselves in the world. Instead, they were retrieving themselves from the world. They no longer felt responsible for carrying the emotions of others. They no longer believed they needed to fix what was broken outside them. Their gaze turned inward, not in self-absorption, but in self-recognition. The world no longer defined their worth, the psyche did. And this marked the beginning of what I call the inner sovereignty of the empath. Inner sovereignty is not a loud state. It does not declare itself. It does not seek followers or applause. It is the quiet, knowing that one's emotional life belongs solely to oneself. It is the understanding that one can feel deeply without being pulled into the gravitational forces of other people's unresolved psychologies. It is the realization that empathy is a gift, but a gift that must be governed by consciousness, not by compulsion. In old age, the compulsions fall away. What remains is clarity. This clarity allows the older empath to see something that was invisible to them in youth, that not all suffering is meant to be absorbed. Some suffering belongs to others, and it must remain theirs if they are ever to grow. The empath learns, after decades of exhaustion and heartbreak, that rescuing someone from their own lessons is not compassion, but interference. They learn that boundaries are not walls, but channels through which authentic relationship can flow. They learn that saying no is not rejection, but self-respect. And their energy, once scattered among countless emotional entanglements, begins to gather back into the center of their being. This gathering is one of the most exquisite experiences of the later life of an empath. It feels like a return, like coming home after having wandered for decades through the emotional terrains of others. They may sit quietly, perhaps in a favorite chair or beneath a familiar tree, and feel something they rarely felt in their youth, the fullness of their own presence. There is a richness to this presence, a warmth that does not collapse into sentimentality, a solitude that does not collapse into loneliness. It is a solitude filled with meaning, with memory, with the sense of having lived not just broadly but deeply. And here, in this quiet fullness, the empath begins to understand the strange paradox of their life, that their greatest pain was also their greatest teacher. Every heartbreak expanded their emotional vocabulary. Every disappointment sharpened their intuition. Every betrayal revealed a shadow within themselves they had not yet faced. And every act of compassion, especially the ones that were not reciprocated, strengthened their connection to the archetypal field of the healer. They begin to see their life not as a long struggle against sensitivity, but as a long apprenticeship within it. This apprenticeship becomes especially evident in the way older empaths view relationships in youth. They often attracted people who sensed their openness, their giving nature, their willingness to absorb what others refuse to confront. These relationships were often unbalanced and exhausting, but In old age, the empath gains a new relationship to connection. They choose people differently. They no longer gravitate toward those who demand emotional caretaking. They are drawn instead to relationships that feel reciprocal, kid, grounded in authenticity. The emotional drama that once entangled them now repels them, not because they fear it, but because they see through it. They recognize projection when it appears. They recognize emotional manipulation in its earliest stages. They recognize the difference between someone who wants to grow and someone who wants to use them as an emotional container. This recognition does not make them superior, it makes them free. Freedom is another hallmark of the empath's elder years, but it is not the freedom of escape. It is the freedom of understanding. When the empath finally understands themselves, they stop being imprisoned by their patterns. They no longer seek validation from people who cannot give it. They no longer cling to those who misunderstand them. They no longer hope that others will one day see their heart clearly. They understand that their heart is not meant for everyone, and that this is not a loss but a protection. Dreams in this stage often reveal a new symbol, the open field, a vast landscape without walls, without obstacles, without boundaries that confine. The field represents the soul's expansion into its authentic space. It represents a psyche no longer compressed by the expectations of others. It represents the openness that emerges when one stops negotiating with the world and begins to stand fully in oneself. When an older empath dreams of a field, it is often a sign that they have entered a new phase of individuation, a phase where the self becomes the central organizing principle of their life. In waking life, this openness manifests as a kind of gentle detachment. They are involved in life, but not entangled in it. They participate, but do not cling. They give, but do not deplete themselves. They love, but do not lose themselves. This balance is one of the great achievements of the empath's later years, and it often emerges only after decades of inner struggle. You must understand, the empath's power was never in their ability to feel, but in their ability to feel without dissolving. In old age, they finally achieve this, and with this inner stability comes a heightened sensitivity to symbolism. Ordinary moments begin to feel meaningful. A bird landing near them, a sudden breeze, the way a shadow moves across the room. The empath senses these not as coincidences, but as subtle messages from the unconscious. The world speaks to them in symbols because they have finally learned to listen without needing to interpret everything intellectually. Their perception becomes panoramic, not focused on explanations, but on presence. There's also a profound shift in the way they relate to death. Younger people often see death as an interruption, an end, a rupture, but the older empath senses death differently. They sense it as a transition, a returning, a dissolving into the same field of consciousness from which life emerged. Death becomes less of a threat and more of a mirror, reflecting back the truth that the psyche has always known, that everything is temporary except the inner journey. I do not say this to romanticize aging, but to point to a psychological reality. Those who have spent their lives close to the emotional dimension of experience often sense the threshold between worlds long before they approach it physically. This sensitivity to death does not produce fear, it produces wisdom, it produces tenderness, it produces gratitude for even the smallest experiences. The older empath becomes deeply aware of what I call the sacredness of ordinary life. They understand that meaning is not found in grand achievements, but in small acts of awareness. The warmth of a cup in their hands, the sound of distant laughter, the texture of silence in the early morning, these details, once overlooked, now feel like revelations. This sensitivity is not regression, it is expansion. The psyche, near the end of its earthly journey, becomes acutely aware of its own beauty. And yet, the older empath rarely speaks about these experiences openly. They are not interested in impressing others with their insights. They no longer feel the need to teach or correct or guide unless explicitly asked. Their wisdom is not loud, it is atmospheric. You feel it more than you hear it. When you sit with them, there is a sense of being seen without being judged, known without being exposed, accepted without needing to perform. This is the rare emotional field. They carry a field created not through theory, but through a lifetime of feeling. I have often thought that if society understood the psychological value of older empaths, they would be treated as living libraries. Their hearts contain maps of emotional landscapes most people never explore. Their minds hold patterns of human behavior they can recognize instantly. Their intuition has been sharpened not by mystical talent, but by decades of witnessing, enduring, observing. They are the bearers of an emotional intelligence that is not easily measured, but deeply felt. And ironically, they often live quietly, unnoticed by the very people who would benefit from their presence the most. If you ask an older empath what they long for in this stage of life, they rarely mention dramatic desires. They do not crave attention or praise. What they long for is simplicity, sincerity, depth. They long for conversations that feel real, for moments that feel honest, for relationships that are reciprocal. They long for understanding not from others, but within themselves, and perhaps most profoundly, they long for peace, not the temporary peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the enduring peace that comes from no longer betraying themselves. This peace is the culmination of their journey. It is the realization that their sensitivity, which once caused them so much suffering, has now become the doorway through which they access the deepest layers of the human experience. Their emotional openness, once a source of vulnerability, has now become the foundation of their inner strength. Their solitude, once feared, has now become fertile ground for insight. This is the silent beauty of the empath. In old age, they become the guardians of a wisdom that cannot be taught, only lived. And so we arrive at the final movement of the empath's long psychological journey. A journey that spans not only years but layers of consciousness. If youth is the stage of absorption, and midlife the stage of conflict and awakening, then old age is the stage of synthesis. It is the moment when the psyche gathers everything it has lived, everything it has endured, everything it has felt, and weaves it into a tapestry that reveals what was hidden all along. The empath, more than anyone, reaches this stage with a kind of luminous depth. Their entire life becomes a symbolic text, and they themselves become its interpreter. You must understand that the empath's old age is not a decline, it is an unveiling. It is a point at which the emotional sensitivity that once overwhelmed them becomes the organ of perception through which they understand the essence of being. Their sensitivity is no longer reactive, it is reflective. It no longer pulls them into the turbulence of other people's emotions. It allows them to see through those emotions into the psychological truths beneath. This is why older empaths often speak less, not because they have grown tired, but because they have grown precise. They understand that many conflicts in the world arise not from malice, but from unconsciousness. They see how people project their wounds onto others without realizing it. They see how the ego clings to narratives to protect itself. They see how fear disguises itself as anger, how longing appears as attachment, how shame turns into defensiveness. They see all of this with remarkable clarity, and yet they no longer feel responsible for correcting it. They allow people to remain on their path, knowing that every soul has its own timing. This respect for psychic timing is one of the greatest gifts of the older empath. They have learned through decades of experience that forcing insight upon someone does not awaken them. It only threatens their defenses. They know that true transformation occurs only when a person is ready to face their own unconscious, and so the empath offers space instead of solutions, presence instead of pressure, understanding instead of instruction. Their wisdom becomes a quiet river, flowing beneath the surface of interactions, shaping others not through influence, but through resonance. In this stage of life, many empaths also experience what I call the archetypal shift. They begin to embody a new archetype, not the wounded healer, not the martyr, not the caretaker, but the sage. The sage is not one who knows everything, but one who understands what cannot be known. The sage stands at the threshold between worlds with humility, recognizing the vastness of the psyche and the mystery of existence. For the empath, this shift is profound because it signals the completion of an inner cycle. They are no longer defined by their reactions to the world. They are rooted in their relationship with themselves. This internal rooting becomes especially evident in the way they experience solitude. What was once a place of emptiness becomes a place of nourishment. They begin to realize that solitude is not the absence of others, but the presence of the self. In solitude, the empath senses the quiet movements of the unconscious more clearly. They notice subtle shifts in emotion. They perceive intuitive insights that rise like gentle waves from the depths. They feel an inner companionship that youth could not provide. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, a place where they commune with symbols, memories, and archetypal energies that have shaped their entire psychological existence. It is often in these quiet hours that older empaths begin to reflect on their dreams with new reverence. The dreams of late life often carry a certain purity, images stripped of unnecessary drama, symbols distilled to their essence. The unconscious becomes unapologetically honest in its communication. Bridges, lakes, wide fields, open doors, fading light, ancestral figures, these become common motifs, not because they signify endings, but because they signify transitions. The psyche prepares itself gently, weaving symbolic pathways that guide the individual toward acceptance, and the empaths, with their lifelong sensitivity to nuance, senses this guidance. They do not fear it. They do not resist it. They meet it with curiosity, with openness, with the same heart that once felt the pain of the world, but now feels its deeper meaning. It is as if the entire unconscious, personal and collective, begins to speak to them in a unified voice, a voice that says, "You have lived deeply, and now you may rest deeply." But rest for the older empaths does not mean withdrawal from life. On the contrary, it often means stepping into life more fully, but with less attachment. They savor moments with a kind of intensity that only those who understand impermanence can feel. A quiet morning, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the warmth of a familiar hand, the softness of a memory returning without pain. These moments acquire a sacred quality. The empath becomes an artist of presence, painting meaning onto even the simplest experiences. And this presence has a powerful effect on others. People often feel unusually safe around older empaths. Though they cannot articulate why, it is because the empath no longer projects their own unresolved emotions into interactions. Their presence is uncluttered, clean, receptive. They can hold another person's sorrow without absorbing it, witness another's confusion without needing to fix it, stand near another's vulnerability without collapsing into their own. This emotional clarity creates a field of psychological safety, a field in which others can sense themselves more honestly. If you ever have the privilege of sitting with an older empath, you might notice that they possess a kind of atmosphere, something unsaid but profoundly felt. It is the atmosphere of someone who has made peace with their shadow. They no longer hide the parts of themselves that were once too painful to acknowledge. They no longer feel ashamed of their wounds. They no longer fear their darkness. They carry their shadow as one might carry a loyal animal, quietly, respectfully, without attempting to disguise it. This integration is visible in their eyes, in the calmness of their voice, in the way they look at the world without flinching. It is also visible in the way they love. Love in old age is not the urgent, searching, longing love of youth. It is not intertwined with fear or need. It is steadier, quieter, more spacious. The older empath loves without expectation. They love from abundance rather than from longing. They love not because they need another person to complete them, but because they themselves are complete. This kind of love is rare and often misunderstood, but those who encounter it never forget it, because it feels like being seen by life itself. As the empath continues their journey through old age, they also develop a clearer sense of what they wish to leave behind, not in the material sense, but in the psychological sense. The legacy of the empath is never measured in possessions, but in presence. It is measured in the quiet ways. They have shaped others in the hearts, they have softened in the insides, they have sparked in the safe spaces they have created, in the emotional truths they have affirmed simply by existing authentically. The older empath does not need to be remembered widely. They need only to be remembered deeply. And while they rarely articulate it, many older empaths carry a feeling that their life was both heavier and richer than that of most people. Heavy because they felt more, rich because they understood more. This duality does not trouble them in old age. It comforts them. They see that their path, though often painful, was meaningful. They see that their sensitivity, though often misunderstood, was purposeful. They see that their wounds, though hard-earned, were wise, and they understand that the beauty of their life was not found in avoiding suffering, but in remaining open despite it. This openness is the empath's final triumph. It is what allows them to approach their remaining years not with fear, but with a kind of serene dignity. They have lived enough to know that the psyche is not fragile, but resilient, not chaotic, but intelligent, not aimless, but deeply purposeful. They trust the unconscious. They trust their inner voice. They trust the strange synchronicities that continue to appear. They trust the mysterious order of life that has guided them all along, even when they could not perceive it. And perhaps most profoundly, they trust themselves. This trust is the culmination of individuation, the psychological process of becoming who one truly is. It is the realization that the self, the center of the psyche, is not something one must seek, but something one must allow. And the empath, more than anyone, discovers this later in life, when the noise of the world has faded enough for them to finally hear the quiet rhythm of their own essence. When the empath reaches this state, they embody a kind of silent beauty, one that does not draw attention, but radiates inwardly. It is the beauty of acceptance, of depth, of understanding, of inner coherence. It is the beauty of a heart that has felt beyond words and yet is no longer burdened by what it feels. It is the beauty of a soul that carries softness without fragility, wisdom without superiority, sensitivity without suffering. This is the empath in old age, not a withered heart, but a refined one, not a diminished soul, but an illuminated one, not a fragile being, but a complete one. And if you listen closely, you will hear the quiet truth they carry, that to feel deeply is not a curse, but a passage, that to be misunderstood is not failure, but initiation, that to grow older is not to fade, but to reveal, and in that revelation lies the silent beauty of a heart that feels beyond words,